Good day, students, and welcome to a lecture on the history of India from 1206 to 1550. Today, we are going to learn about slavery in India during the period of the Delhi Sultanate. Now, historian Peter Jackson has commented that when the forces of Muhammad Khuri invaded India in the decade of the 1190s, they introduced the concept of the military slave or Mamluk to India. This type of slavery should not be confused with the slavery which dated back to ancient Greece or Rome, or the type of slavery used in the American colonies. The Mamluk was a distinctive type of slave, receiving religious and military education and employed in important posts. The institution dates back to the 9th century CE, when the Abbasid caliphs appointed Mamluk guards. The Mamluks became a significant political force in the 13th century when in Egypt the Mamluk officers overthrew the Ayyubid Sultan and started a new Mamluk Sultanate. The Delhi Sultanate has also been designated as a Mamluk Sultanate, as it was founded by Qutbuddin Aibak, or as he was also known, Qutb al-Din Aibeg, and was then ruled again by Aibak's slave Shams al-Din Iltutmish. Mamluk officers held important posts and had considerable influence in the Sultanate in the first 90 years of its existence. Thus, this discussion of slavery in India during the Sultanate period will primarily focus on this type of slavery. Now, we need to look into the origin of this form of slavery in South Asia. Historians have traced it to the Ghaznavid dynasty of Afghanistan. Turkish slave soldiers, also known as ghulams, had founded the Ghaznavid state, and these ghulams traced their origin back to the slave soldiers of the 9th century Abbasid Caliphate. In the 10th century, in Central Asia, the Samanid rulers had reproduced this institution. The Samanids had started this career as landed notables who functioned as semi-autonomous governors under the caliphs of Baghdad. They had managed to establish a unified base of power by recruiting other lords. But they had also felt the need to have a personal guard that would be loyal to the ruler alone. And thus, they continued the tradition of military slavery in Central Asia. These slaves had to be absolutely loyal and outside the normal political scheming of the Central Asian courts. Thus, they were recruited from Inner Asia, having no ties or social position in the Samanid state. They were entirely dependent upon the ruler for their safety and benefits. These slaves were given military training and were seen as highly disciplined. In time, this cohort of slave soldiers would grow to be as many as 10,000, and they proved to be a very useful weapon in the political game. While most of the slaves were loyal, the slave officers would sometimes break away and form their own states. Thus, the slave general Alaptigin fell out with the Samanid ruler and took his escort to the small town of Ghazni, thus laying the foundation for the Ghaznavid polity. The infamous Ghaznavid ruler Sultan Mahmud was the son of one of Alaptigin's slaves. Mahmud's attacks on India would see the beginning of the entry of military slavery into India. The Ghaznavid system of slave soldiers left an important legacy. Firstly, the slaves were a numerical minority in the Ghaznavid state, but they occupied the most important posts in the army. There was a significant rift between them and the non-military elite Muslim lineages. Secondly, the Ghaznavids needed to intermarry and form alliances with the local notables. While initially leaders were elected, they tried to expand their power base and ensure patrilineal succession. Thus, the slave general Shabuktugin increased his power to ensure that his own son succeeded. Thirdly, the common humble origins of slave generals was widely known. Initially, the slave generals prided themselves on this and maintained cordial relations with the Samanids and later with the Abbasid caliphs. But their legacy of slavery undermined their legitimacy as many nobles were less than willing to submit to their rule. Fourthly, the slaves were organized in a hierarchy, with new recruits starting with menial tasks and the senior-most being closest to the Sultan. Fifthly, the institution of military slavery spawned an entire genre of Persian and Arabic historical texts that tried to memorialize the life and deeds of the Ghaznavid rulers and the prominent slave soldiers. In addition to the system of military slavery, it should be noted that the Ghaznavids also enslaved thousands of Indian men, women, and children. They did not receive the treatment of the skilled soldier slaves. They were referred to as Barda or Abid. They were taken to the slave markets of Ghazni and then onwards to those of Central Asia. According to historian Scott Levy, Hindus were in demand in Central Asian slave markets. Skilled slaves like sculptors, architects, craftsmen were highly prized. Others were employed in menial tasks like agriculture and domestic labor. After the Ghaznavids, it was the Ghurid dynasty that came to power in Afghanistan. The slave system was continued in this dynasty. In fact, Juzjani, the principal Persian chronicler of this period, noted that all of the sultans were born of female slaves of Turkic or Anatolian descent. These female slaves were also not just passive witnesses, but played active and even violent roles in the dynastic politics of the regime, even murdering a prince during a power struggle. Thus, the slaves were actively shaping politics in the Ghurid Sultanate. Slave soldiers were used relatively late in Ghurid history due to the fact that they took a long time to train. Thus, Qutbuddin Aibak was leading armies in 1192, which was exactly 20 years after the accession of the Sultan who had started his training. Initially, Ghurid raids into India were not too successful, but they were necessary, as in addition to any monetary gains, they needed to capture people to enslave. Initially, the Ghurid sultans may have been a bit reluctant to enlarge the number of slave soldiers, but after a number of incidents where the principal nobles proved to be unreliable, the advantage of a cavalry force of slave soldiers became clear. Once the campaigns with the slave soldiers started, they proved to be extremely successful. They won huge victories in the Punjab, and that in turn was used as a base for further attacks into the country. While the Ghurid nobility often showed reluctance at actually staying in India and always preferred to return to Afghanistan, the slave soldiers who were loyal and reliable could easily be garrisoned in the conquered territories. The commanders were given slaves of their own to manage the collection of revenue. By the times of the deaths of Muhammad Ghuri and Qutbuddin Aibak, this system had been solidly established in India. One very important aspect of the slave training and creation of loyalty and cohesion was the manufacturing of identity. This was done in several ways. the most common of which was naming. Naming allowed a paternalistic begetting of identity and also marked the social rank of the individual. Thus, earlier Ghaznavid names ended with the suffix tegin, meaning lord. The prefixes also carried meanings. For example, Alp meant hero. We also see names like Kiran or slaughterer, Sanchar or piercer. And to these were added Arabic titles like those which were related to religion, like Nasir al-Din, the helper of religion. Another means of identity creation was language, and senior slaves spoke Turkic. So important was this language that even Persian speakers tried to learn it. Another way of identity creation was emphasizing physical and behavioral features. Thus, these slaves were always described as being more fair. Important slave families maintained close relations and practiced intermarriage. Their training emphasized treating each other as total equals, creating group cohesion. Thus, through these steps, slaves were given a strong common identity that united them and set them apart from other groups. After the Ghurid conquest of North India, since Muhammad Ghuri had no sons, his slave commanders Kutubuddin Aibak, Taj al-Din Yildiz and Tugril assumed royal titles. While this was a political triumph, they continued to acknowledge their old master as freed slaves in their coins. Aibak proved to be the most powerful of the three, but he had an untimely early death in 1210. In this situation, his slaves at Lahore raised his son Aram Shah to the throne, and the various slave commanders were bound to swear loyalty to him as the son of Aibak who had been their master. The situation, however, became more complicated. Most of the frontier commanders enjoyed a lot of autonomy and power, having their own slave armies. The most powerful and experienced of this group was Iltutmish, and when Aram Shah died, he took power. Iltutmish hailed from a region near the Black Sea and had apparently been sold into slavery by his jealous brothers. He was a naturally able man, being trained by both Muhammad Ghuri and Aibak, and he had received promotion and ascended the hierarchy of slaves at high speed. He was eminently qualified from a political standpoint to take over after Aibak, but his overriding of the claims of Aram Shah, who was after all the son of his dead master, created legal problems. So legal fiction was created where Muslim jurists had approached Iltutmish and asked him to rule to safeguard the nascent Muslim kingdom in North India. Iltutmish's reign was heavily influenced by the then ongoing Mongol conquests through Central Asia. These had a range of effects. Firstly, the Mongol rampages caused thousands of refugees to flee to India for shelter. Among these were powerful, rich, and influential men, and their retinues who were given refuge by the Sultan and who could then become collaborators in this regime. Secondly, the Mongols captured and sold thousands of slaves in various slave markets, and naturally, this flow of slaves reached the markets of India. This helped further in the consolidation of the slave polity. Thirdly, the devastation of the Mongols badly weakened would-be rivals in Afghanistan and Central Asia, while Iltutmish's own core areas of North India, that is, the Punjab, Delhi, and the upper Gangetic Valley were untouched. This meant that Iltutmish would enjoy relatively greater power and stability than his neighbors. This period saw a transformation in the Sultanate polity that distinguished it from other slave states. Firstly, Iltutmish was far more powerful than any other slave ruler and could absolutely guarantee patrilineal succession for his descendants. Secondly, the influx and existence of many Central Asian elites meant that non slave nobility could also play a major role in state formation and function. Thirdly, the Sultanate army had to be built up fast as it was needed against the Indian rulers of the rest of the country on the one hand, and the chance of a Mongol invasion from the west on the other. Thus, this period also saw the rapid recruitment and promotion of slaves and provided a great opportunity for advancement to junior slaves. Iltutmish's death caused a struggle for succession, with various princes and one princess fighting for the throne. This period, which included the troubled reign of his daughter Razia, saw numerous factions comprising coalitions of senior slaves, including African and Indian slaves, all vying for supremacy. The ultimate winner of the struggle was the slave Balban, and he owed his success to being able to recruit and promote junior slaves. These junior slaves had not had the time to form a close relationship with Iltutmish or his family. And so, when Razia started promoting non Turks, these slaves became discontented and sought the leadership of Balban, who guaranteed their customary advancement and favor. Even as Balban rose to the throne with his control over the slaves, processes were underway that would change the nature of the slave sultanate. Firstly, while Balban brought more people under the scope of his control, such as frontiersmen and their retinues, the children of his existing slaves, etc., to meet the needs of the ever expanding imperial state, he was also confronted with the problem that many disobedient slaves were fleeing into the forests that still covered much of North India at this time. Balban ordered punitive raids into these forests as well as large scale deforestation to rob the rebels of their shelter. Thus, more and more land became exposed to cultivate in the fertile plains, and with the influx of new technology, farming was even possible in the dry season. This resulted in the expansion of the peasant class, who were in reality mere agricultural laborers under the control of the village level landlord or zamindars. This created a large pool of non slave military labor that would eventually sideline military slavery in North India in the coming centuries. Thirdly, the supply of Central Asian slaves declined as the great Mongol regimes stabilized, and regimes like the Ilkhanate of Iran converted to Islam. Simultaneously, the number of slaves from Africa and India greatly increased. While Balban was the last slave sultan, later rulers like Alauddin Khalji had over 50,000 slaves, most of them Indians. Among them were extremely important men of state like Malik Kafur. Later in the 14th century, Firoz Shah Tughlaq had over 1,80,000 slaves, and the vast majority were from different regions of South Asia, even distant places like Arakan. Another very important phenomenon was African slavery. African slaves were captured inland and exported through ports like Zanzibar into the Indian Ocean. They were known as Habashi or Abyssinian slaves. These slaves were already present in the 13th century, and when the Sultanate actually reached the coasts, they were able to take advantage of maritime networks to directly import from Africa. Even though the Sultanate had to retreat later, they had bequeathed a powerful legacy to the successor coastal states, and Habashi slaves became an important and powerful element in Deccan politics. In the Bahmani, Adil Shahi, and Nizam Shahi states, the Habashi slaves played pivotal roles in politics between the 14th and 17th centuries. Habashi generals like Malik Ambar controlled military powers of central India, and in the 16th and 17th centuries even resisted Mughal expansion. Even as far east as Bengal, a contingent of 8,000 Habashi slaves essentially determined who the local ruler would be. The end of the 14th century saw huge changes in the condition of slavery in India. The Tughlaq Empire weakened and started to disintegrate from the end of the reign of Firuz Shah Tughlaq in 1388. The Sultanate's military prowess and its security were shattered when Timur and his army invaded and defeated the meager forces of the Sultanate. Delhi was sacked and burned in 1398, and thousands of slaves were taken away to Central Asia. The Sultanate shrank to just Punjab and the Ganga-Yamuna Doab region. It was cut off from Central Asia and from the coasts, and hence the lucrative Indian Ocean trade as well as the source of African slaves. Moreover, this weakened, shrunken Sultanate lacked the power and ability to enslave the masses of Indians who still made up the agrarian revenue base of the state. This disintegration greatly reduced the importance of slavery in South Asia. Firstly, the frontier commanders and tribes increased their power and importance. After the death of the Timurid ruler Shah Rukh in 1447, Timurid armies lost control of Afghanistan, but there was no powerful South Asian state to assert itself in this region. Thus, frontier powers like the Lodis, who controlled the vital horse trade, took this opportunity to increase their power, and they even managed to ascend the throne of Delhi. Secondly, with the expansion of agriculture and the existence of the teeming millions of peasants in North India, who could be recruited through agents or the zamindars, it became more practicable and preferable for sultans to recruit peasant armies rather than the far more complex and expensive slave armies. Thus, in conclusion, in the 15th century, we see that due to a range of factors, military slavery greatly receded in importance in India. Thank you.